I think we'll wait for maybe a few more minutes and then start.
Yeah.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Parvati.
Hi, hi. Nice to see you all.
Hi. Nice to see you too.
Really looking forward to the event. Thank you.
Sure. And hi, Shraddha. I don't know Naomi and Barsha, but hello, welcome.
Barsha is from PLD.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Hi. Yes, I'm from PLD.
And Kim. Welcome. Saptarshi, hi.
Hi, Saptarshi. Long time.
Indeed. Hi, Sunita.
Hi.
Hi, Madhushri.
Hi, everyone.
Hi. Okay, great. Okay, I think we will get started then. Welcome everyone to our March seminar on social reproduction. It's really wonderful that all of you could join us despite the quite trying circumstances under which we find ourselves with the pandemic or war and whatnot. So today I'm really, really delighted to welcome Madhu Mehra, who is a feminist lawyer. And she heads research and training at Partners for Law and Development. And she's a women's rights activist who has been crucial to several campaigns around law reform in India. And today in particular, she's going to speak to us about reframing the contemporary child marriage debate, lessons from India. And as we know that there are quite a lot of proposals for reform around the institution of marriage that has come out of the current regime. And the debate around child marriage is a particularly tricky one. And Madhu has been quite closely involved with studying quite empirically, various facets of adolescent sexuality in the context of the rape law reforms and understandings of consent. And so I'm really glad that she'll be able to speak to us today, both as a lawyer, but also somebody who has a very good grip on the empirical realities of adolescent sexuality, marriage, and consent. So welcome to Madhu. I now hand over to her.
Thanks, Prabha. I'm really pleased to be invited to this forum and to be able to present as part of your conversation series. What I propose to do through my presentation is to really bring out the disjuncture between the dominant narrative on child marriage and the reality as we know, at least in India, and perhaps more broadly, but in India more confidently, as well as the harms of an age and a law-centric approach to child marriage on the lives of the very group of population it seeks to protect. Let me begin by saying that my presentation will draw on the work of PLD as well as its allies and partners, all of us who have been really active in the last few years on this issue. Essentially, I'll break my presentation into 3 parts. I don't have a PPT. I will talk about the re-emergence of child marriage on the global scenario as a priority issue. And then in the second part, I will look at what the context in India is, what the trajectory has been, as well as the evidence in relation to law, which has been fairly complex over the years. In the last part, I will sort of raise questions about where we are and what this says about fulfilling the various rights in Child Rights Convention and all the other things we've signed on to. So in terms of the re-emergence of child marriage on the global scenario, it's been a very old issue. This is not the first, time we're talking about child marriage. CEDAW talks about it. There have been treaties prior to that as well on the issue of minimum age of marriage. So it was really in 2015 with the Sustainable Development Goals that the issue came up. And we have, in a sense, child marriage placed as one of the indicators of gender inequality, eliminating child marriage as part of addressing harmful practices. So it's 2015, which becomes a watershed moment, really, when we find a lot of funds allocated towards addressing child marriage and a convergence of both governments and civil society organizations globally, formation of new coalitions who are combating the issue of child marriage, and a lot of policy activity. So we have resolutions from the Human Rights Council, and in the sort of civil society space, we have a recognition, a widespread recognition of SADC, which is the South African Development Community's model law on child marriage, no exception law, which is sort of held up as the model law for the world. We see as part of this sort of funds available for attaining SDGs, facilitating a lot of sort of activity in South Asia as part of international organizations. So there are very clear repercussions that we see in South Asia, where SADC, which is the South African model, which is held up as a global model, is sort of introduced. And we find that the SARC initiative on ending violence against children, SIVAC, adopt this similar no exception model as in its regional plan, and sort of promised by all the states, all the SARC countries to actually implement national or create national plans around that. So in this policy space, we find sort of a very strong presence of international organizations, and I might mention Center for Reproductive Rights, CRR, which played a really prominent role in collaborating with national partner organizations to publish a series of policy briefs, all of which are titled Ending Impunity for Child Marriage. And we have one such brief for India, of course, as well as Nepal and Bangladesh and Pakistan. And what is the, and they're just as active on the SARC platform and the SIVAC initiative, the regional plan. So So all of this happens very quickly after 2015, which really hasn't given us enough time to look at what the evidence on the ground is. And it's based on a particular narrative of child marriage, and I will come to that narrative. But essentially what the recommendations of, of this policy series on ending impunity for child marriage is to instate a very strong criminalization and a surveillance legal regime, so that it's not just the child marriage laws, but also the compulsory registration of marriage and is sort of deployed to ensure that the state can monitor child marriage much more closely, and also invalidate it completely. So the law to sort of treat it as invalid. And recommendations also extend to elimination of judicial discretion and putting in place mandatory minimum sentences, high sentences. We find that the Office of the High Commissioner, the OHCHR, formulates sort of its framework on child marriage as what is called CEFMU, which is child early forced marriages and unions. So in a sense, all these are treated as a homogeneous unit, whether it's child, whether it's early, which signifies adolescence, and treats both categories of marriages as forced on the premise that anyone under 18 has no capacity at all to consent, so it must be forced, therefore, and to treat unions also on par with marriages. And then, so we have this sort of a zero tolerance framework, which is called really the no exception framework. And let me explain what no exception might mean. I think globally one has seen that across different jurisdictions, there is either religious laws which allow underage marriage, or laws that allow underage marriage with parental consent, variation in minimum ages of marriage, so that some countries might have 18, but others might even allow at 14, and some versions of Islamic law might say puberty, defining puberty variously. So the no exception model seeks to really broker no exception literally, and not allow, not bestow legal validity on a marriage that is below a universal minimum age, which is 18, the age of adulthood. Which essentially, most of these laws aspire to treat it as a wrong, as an offense, either to simply not recognize it and then attach penalties for adults involved with a marriage, in the marriage. So we find that in about 2018, Nepal amends its laws to make 20 as a minimum age of marriage. In 2017 or around that time, Bangladesh changes its laws. Although it does retain exceptions, it introduces penalties, including for the underage bride. And India sees in Karnataka an introduction of a state amendment which alters the central law to make child marriages void in Karnataka. And in 2020, a similar change was introduced in Haryana. Many of the other states were also toying with the idea, and there were PILs, and so there's civil society activity, filing public interest litigations to say child marriages must end, and the government must be directed to amend the law to make it void ab initio. There's a similar challenge in the Delhi High Court as we speak. It's essentially, this is the narrative around child marriage, that girls are forced, and that this would, once this law comes into being, there would be at least some way of minimizing domestic violence, the burden of domestic labor on girls who are not yet adults. But while the Human Rights Council resolutions passed in this period have been much more complex and cognizant of the many interventions necessary to tackle child marriage and to ensure adolescents have enjoy a modicum of rights. The advocacy space is one where the primary thrust is for no exception laws. Now, if we move now to the second part to look at what is the reality and the context, at least in India. India has a long and a complex history on child marriage laws. It's not a new subject for India. So it's not as if, the minimum age issue of marriage is sort of, we've woken up to it after SDGs. In 1889, with the Pulmoni Das case, the young child who died as a result of rape in marriage, the age of consent was changed to from 10 years to 12 years. And so there is actually a recognition of the overlap between age of consent and marriage, which goes back then when no child marriage law existed. It was a very contested debate in the colonial government. And in 1929, when the Sarda Act came in, there was a concern about child widows, infant marriages, and so on. So we were looking at a particular historic time. And then later in 1978, when the Sarda Act was amended, the aims and objectives of the amendment clearly was speaking to the concerns, political concerns of the time, because there was no mention really of child marriage, but of the urgent need to check population and to reduce the total fertility rates. So that is sort of a complicated journey in lawmaking. And then we have in 2006, the Prohibition of Child Marriage Act, which comes in, which interestingly treats all underage marriages as valid, though voidable, and only in exceptional circumstances treats it as void ab initio. But we see it's also a time when children are getting attention, and we have the Right to Education Act, which provides for free and compulsory education up till 14 years. We have several girl-child programs, including the current one, Beti Bachao, Beti Padhao. So actually the potential for moving beyond marriage to looking at ways of empowering girls is there. Yet at the law reform level, we seem to be stuck on the age of marriage, instead of holding on to some of these gains that we've already sort of, or some of these new pathways that have already opened up. Now, if we look at what is really the context of underage marriage, the national data of the National Family Health Survey says that from 2005 to 2006, when it was 46%, in the fifth survey, which is 2019 to 2020, it's come down to 23%. Without really a law that either punishes stringently or a law that sort of provides for a great deal of surveillance. In fact, this is in spite of having a law which is scarcely implemented, that the rates are coming down. What we see correspondingly is also increase in age of marriage. So the mean age of marriage is around 19 for girls, although yes, it's the larger chunk is in India is early marriage. It's no longer child marriages, although small percentage is still what one would call under 15 marriages. what is also a new aspect or an important aspect of child marriage in India is that it's largely a practice amongst the poor and the marginalized, and it spikes during periods of insecurity and crisis, as we've seen under COVID. There is a great deal of insecurity, and so social norms of sexual purity and so on do drive the underage marriage, but it's not simply the social norms. There are studies which we have, academic studies, as well as, one of the reports PLD did, which is not academic, which shows a linkage between women's labor and both reproductive and productive labor and child marriage. So in contexts where a woman has to work outside the home and it becomes necessary in context of poverty, there is the need to marry the girl, because as some of the studies have shown, that it's girls already under 18 as children shoulder a large amount of domestic work. But to step out of the house and work in paid work, culturally it's more acceptable when they are married. So in a sense, early marriage is an aspect of early onset of adult responsibilities amongst poorer populations. And of course, there is the issue of female purity, which I've already flagged. And despite these findings, what we come across is that the understanding of social norm that is, constantly presented to us, that child marriage, is driven by social norms of early marriage. It's really not so much the social norm that is fixated on early marriage as it is on the compulsory nature of marriage. So I think that's an issue that really needs to be unpacked. What really is the social norm when we're talking about South Asia or India, particularly? Now, one of the things that we hear again as part of the narrative in India is, and as part of the present bill, which proposes to increase the minimum age of marriage to 21 years for girls, is that it will tackle the issue of girls dropping out of senior secondary. It will tackle the issue of girls, of employment, decision-making, and so on. But again, if we turn to the national data, for those scholars who've done that, we see that, again, national data says that girls are dropping out of school. They do join primary school in much larger numbers, but they drop out at the secondary stage because the quality of education is not transformatory. The distance from home to secondary schools is often far, it's unsafe, and that the burden of housework is often the reason why parents pull out the girls, or girls get pulled out. So it's not really early marriage which pulls girls out of school, but it's the need for domestic caregiving and reproductive labor that is what one of the biggest causes. Of course, including the quality of education. And let's also remember that the right to education only covers up till 14 years. So we're expecting girls to marry at 18. What is the answer? What are they to do between 14 and 18 years? That's a question that remains unanswered. And as far as employment is concerned, we know from the data that women's participation in employment in India is one of the lowest in the world. And with the economic distress and livelihood sort of losses under COVID, there's been a further setback. So really, in terms of the larger scenario, in terms of the linkages with all these benefits that are presented as spurring the new amendment, that these seem to be completely fall short of what the the legislative amendment bill is claiming to achieve. Now, if you look at how the law really works, we know the PCMA, or the child marriage law, has been around since 2006. And it's scarcely implemented. And by that, I mean, if we look at the national crime data, it shows an annual number of not more than 500 cases registered and prosecuted under PCMA. The vast bulk of cases are prosecuted for kidnapping for the purposes of marriage, which, no doubt might have some real kidnappings, but by and large, those are cases of elopements. So you have a ratio of 500 to 30,000 approximately. So you have nearly 30,000 cases registered for under Section 366 of the Indian Penal Code versus under Child Marriage Act. And studies conducted by PLD, both in relation to finding out what girls who seek to avoid child marriage, what are the means they use? Is the law accessible to them? And that's one study, and the other study is to analyze the various cases filed in relation to child marriage. We found one, that girls are not able to access law because legal formal prosecution invites a very severe backlash, and both on the girls and on social workers, and their plans are usually caught out if they reveal them early on. So social workers prefer to negotiate rather than prosecute. And the second, when we look at 10 years of prosecutions on child marriage, various kinds of cases, habeas corpus, child marriage cases, rape cases, kidnapping cases, what we find is that 3/4 of the cases that are formally prosecuted relate to elopements and are prosecuted by parents of girls who run away. So it's really, the law is heavily and disproportionately deployed against consenting couples who choose to marry despite parental disapproval. And the nature of penalties for consenting couples is really 10 years mandatory minimum for rape and high punishments for kidnapping versus a maximum of 2 years, if at all, for adults who are prosecuted for child marriage under the child marriage law. So there is a very disproportionate and draconian impact of the combination of these laws and a high age of consent in India, which is at 18, which hurts consenting couples and needs to be addressed if we are really talking about empowering girls and protecting girls and giving them an enabling environment to flourish. So if in a scenario like this, and only 1/3 of the cases that we found actually pertain to child marriages which were arranged. And in that 1/3 as well, there was only very, very few cases which were filed by the legal functionary who's meant to stop marriages. Most of them were cases of young people repudiating a child marriage, which is allowed under the law, because the marriage had broken down for various reasons. So they were not seeking to punish anybody. They were merely seeking to repudiate or nullify their marriages. So I think at this juncture, when we look at the proposals that we have before us of increasing the minimum age of marriage for girls to 21 years, in other words, to declare to declare women as their legal capacity, to equate their legal capacity with that of a child for purposes of marriage up to 21 years, what might it do? I think that's the question before us, that at a time when we really are still facing the pandemic, when schools have been closed for 2 years and have only opened this week, I think, and girls who have no online digital access have been without any schooling whatsoever, what would a proposal that seeks to increase the age of marriage to 21 years do? And I think that's really the debate. It's going to create schools, create opportunities, create resources miraculously, or will it really set back and disempower the girls in ways that we cannot imagine? So I'll close here and look forward to any discussion that follows.
Thank you so much, Madhu, for that really excellent overview of developments on this front and sort of how it relates to a whole set of other laws around women's sexuality. So Madhu is ready for questions. So please do raise your hands or potentially put questions in the chat. So I guess while people collect their thoughts, one of the questions I had was, which was the organization that produced the policy brief for CRR in India? And I guess the second question, and it might be pretty obvious, I'm sorry if I don't know about it, is whether there is a text of the amendment. Do we have a text that's readily available? And it probably is. If you could just walk us through it, that would be useful.
Yeah, so it was really the CLPR in Bangalore, the Center for Law and Policy Research, which partnered, and I think different organizations in other countries partnered with the CRR in other South Asian countries. And the text of the amendment is readily available online. But essentially, in its aims and objectives, it seeks to address the issue of education, maternal mortality, malnourishment, malnutrition, jobs, decision-making, leadership, and unequal sex ratio, interestingly. So almost every sort of social concern is piggybacking on the age of marriage. And the evidence on the ground doesn't, show a correlation. In addition to increasing the minimum age of marriage for girls to 21 years, it also overrides all the religious personal laws, which is the first time we are seeing this happen through an amendment in PCMA, and seeks to increase the period for repudiating marriages to 5 years, which is all right, but that period of repudiation should be extended with all these other changes doesn't really, make sense.
Okay, thank you, Madhu. I think Shraddha had a question. Shraddha, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Madhu, for this presentation. I had two thoughts coming over. One was, given the Indian federal structure, so what is your observation? Are state parties saying anything or raising some issues regarding the current bill? What are there voices coming from within, from different states? And secondly, about when this bill was announced, there were reports coming in that in some pockets, parents are getting their girls married off, so that in case this bill comes in, at least they don't have to be with them for another 3 years or so. So I was attending another conversation on the same issue. There was one point which was raised that this bill might at least give a legal, legal pressure on the parents to not to get the girls married off. But another observation of mine through some literature is that we have these these state welfare policies around girls' marriage. So we see that they kind of fail in their objective, because girls would anyway get married the day they turn 18. So the whole agenda of being transformative for the society. So how we collate these thoughts? I know I'm not very clear, but yeah, you can.
Thanks. Do you want me to answer now, or do you want to collect a few questions?
Yeah, you can go ahead, and then Saptarshi can ask his question.
Okay, so Shraddha, actually, we've seen a lot of, interestingly, initially we saw a lot of support for 21 because it just seemed that the law will, and I think it says a lot about our understanding of the law. We sort of seem to imagine that the law gets implemented in its letter and spirit, and that the whole world becomes, rid of child marriage because there is a law in place. So I think, but gradually, I think there have been some voices in the media. We haven't heard that much from state governments, but Rajasthan has very recently allowed girls to register their child marriages when they attain 18. And it's true that a lot of families have panicked and are getting their daughters married because that's exactly, insecurity is a big trigger for panic marriages and early marriages. And this exactly is an example where people are saying that rather than be punished, let's just marry the girls now. So, but we haven't had state governments really chime in too much on this, on the age of marriage issue, but we've had much greater activity in many states on making child marriages void. So I hope I've answered your question. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for this insights. Thank you.
Okay, okay, Saptarshi, go ahead.
Thanks, Prabha. Hi, Madhu. So one argument is that the amendment is not going to do what it's promising in the statement of objects and reasons because of the reasons that because of what you've explained. That age of marriage it will not. I mean, raising the age of marriage is not going to automatically improve labor force participation or educational attainment and so on and so forth. But what about the? So how do we counter? Or what I'm trying to say is, how do we show the harm of the amendment? Because the amendment is actually not prohibiting child marriages. It's not taking the CRR or the CLPR position. So the law remains as it was earlier, that child marriage remains voidable and not void only in certain exceptional circumstances, and only the age is raised. So although, and I think there's some confusion there because the statement of objects and reasons talks about prohibiting child marriage. That's one of the objectives, but we don't see that objective in the objectives in that particular objective in the clauses, the new clauses, the proposed clauses. So what evidence could one how could one show the harm of the amendment is what my question is.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. So actually, I'm just plugging this study, Child Marriage Prosecutions in India, which is 10 years. I mean, that's the only data we have is the study PLD did of 83 cases filed in relation to child marriage, which shows that prosecutions target elopements. They do not target forced marriages and they do not target arranged marriages. That's one. And of course, that this is only happening within the context of poverty and early adulthood. So who is it going to hurt most? Of course, the poor who are running away and trying to make a life of their own. But I think the other important thing is when you have these policy briefs, they do not talk about reducing the age of sexual consent. Even the CRR brief does not talk. They talk about the compulsory registration of marriage, but they do not talk about reducing the age of consent, which means that in this scenario, you're going to have 10 years mandatory minimum follow because, as you know, CRR was also part of the independent thought, PIL, which said all underage, that wives 15 years upwards now from the marital rape exception turns into statutory rape. So there is no recognition of consent there. It's from one extreme to the other extreme. So you have that. Now, when you have a blanket criminalization of such a huge proportion in law, we know it will be enforced selectively. And I think the harm is that, one, if it's enforced effectively, it renders girls who are married, who have a legitimate legal status, to that of de facto wives, where they lack matrimonial rights. At best, what they will get is maintenance. So that's the one harm. The second harm is there will be selective prosecution of some marriages more than others. And I leave it for you to imagine. The UP draft rules to PCMA that was introduced in December 2021 said that compulsory POCSO prosecutions would follow in all child marriage cases. Now, it's still draft rules. We don't know what the final is, and we did send in, our inputs on that. But what we're going to see is that some kinds of underage marriages are going to be prosecuted very severely with draconian sentences of 10 years, no judicial discretion, whereas others can go under 2 years or less than that, or with fine. So, and given that we also have anti-conversion laws that are being introduced in some of the states, which require adults to seek prior permission in case of interfaith marriages, we can just see which way this might go, which way the sort of targeted prosecutions might go. I think that is, and I think the danger of denying adult men and women the right to choose what they want to do with their lives is an absolute harm. So I even outside of this evidence, I don't see how one can disable adults from making decisions about their life. So yeah, if that's clear, I mean, which way this could go in any which way, but it's only bad. It doesn't portend any good.
Great, thank you.
Could I ask a quick question, if I may?
Yes, please do. We can't hear you very well.
Sorry, I've got a really faulty computer. Sorry about this. I don't know too much about this, and that's, it's been really fascinating, but also very alarming to hear this. Can I just ask, I mean, is there a kind of a feminist response? Has there been a pushback? And sorry if all of you know this, and apologies for asking things.
Yes, there has been a pushback in terms. I think what has been absolutely wonderful is that there's been a coming together of PLD. My organization is a women's rights organization, but we're part of a coalition which has public health organizations, child rights organizations, and many of whom have supported stringent law reform on child marriage, have changed their positions and acknowledged that they've changed their position. So I think many of us have come together to actually demand that the whole issue of age of consent be addressed, that sexual reproductive rights of adolescent girls be recognized and be made available. And that right to education be extended to 21 years. So we've got a whole shopping list of suggestions that will actually create opportunities and support for girls who are most likely and most vulnerable to early marriage. So yes, we've come together. The larger women's movement has perhaps not been so engaged with the issue, but I think sections of child rights and women's rights and other organizations have been pretty active and consistently responding to all the government proposals.
That's great. Actually, Parvati, I think we've shared some of the resources in the chat section. I think there's one link to what the feminists have stated, but I think I wanted to ask a follow-up on that, which is, obviously it's been referred to a standing committee, and have you been called to present evidence yet? And
no, not yet. Many of us made submissions to the standing committee. I also believe many groups have written in saying they agree with the proposal. So, it's not, because we have been vocal, at least, this coalition and many of the allied organizations have been fairly vocal about our position. We don't know what the other groups are thinking, the ones who are not so vocal. But I believe submissions have gone in. And going by some of the newspaper editorials, they have supported the move. But, some have added these other dimensions that we have said about making available opportunities and resources and so on. But I think the one important thing for lesson for the global discourse as well has been that this whole business of all underage marriages being forced has ignored the fact that elopements is a significant and a growing trend, not just in India, world over. Mexico, parts of Mexico, which again is a federation where no exception laws have been introduced, they've seen a drop in child marriages or underage marriages, but they've seen a rise in unions. So what is it really we are doing? Is it just a game of managing numbers? Because if the solution is so fixated on age, we're losing sight of the girl, who is very central to the whole, to the problem. So how do we shift the focus on empowerment and the little sort of building blocks of empowerment? Because we've totally been consumed by the age issue. And I have to add that before the SDGs in 2014, the CEDAW and the CRC put out a joint general comment on child marriage, on harmful practices, including child marriage, where they agreed that between 16 and 18, marriages could be legal based on, the relative maturity of the girl and the circumstances in question. The intense international lobbying that followed thereafter, after the SDGs, compelled the CEDAW and the CRC to redact that and adopt a no exception position. So it is always groups which, like us, who are doing, like many of us who are doing a lot of empirical work on the ground, data collecting. We are not international players. We are not going to but there are international organizations see themselves as representing this issue worldwide. And we've created a narrative which conflates elopements with older men marrying younger girls, which is, when I speak with civil society organizations in parts of Africa, that is the big concern. That's what they mean when they talk about no exception laws. But actually, it's a child marriage or underage marriage is a very differentiated terrain. It cannot have a uniform response. And I think that is being lost sight of globally. And that's very troubling.
I think Saptarshi had a follow-up question, which is whether there was any study of the Karnataka amendment to the PCMA.
Yes, Yes. So Saptarshi, we've actually completed a study and we are still in the throes of finalizing it and putting it out. Karnataka has seen a spike in underage marriages under COVID. It continues to happen. Elopements are being prosecuted as before. Many of the prosecutions fail because the couple cannot establish that they were married legally. So they get into the criminal justice system and then they get thrown out. So, so that is the Karnataka experience. And also, I think it needs to be said that the Shivraj Patil committee, which recommended this law, recommended a host of other measures, none of which have seen the light of day. So this tends to always happen, that all the social and economic interventions, which are absolutely fundamental to pulling people out of marginalization, get abandoned, and the only thing we are left holding is a law.
Great, thank you.
Prabha, can I ask a question? I'm a bit outside.
Of course, please.
Thank you, Madhu.
Hi, Sunita.
Very hi. You know, one of the concerns I'm having, and I think it's largely a personal concern, is that during the 2012 campaign in the Criminal Amendment Act, etc., there was a lot of pushback from the members of parliament on, to us on raising the age of consent, and it did go to 18, right? 16 to 18. Now, if we bring it back, we know how conservative this government is. I'm not talking about, going back on our principles and values, but when we combine too many asks, it's very difficult to get through the system, to work on what we want to hold on to largely, which is, not increasing the age of marriage. What do you think about that?
So I don't think it's a good idea to say, let's go back to 16. It's not about just going back to 16. I think the whole recognition of coercion, consent has to now help us develop a much more nuanced understanding of consent under certain conditions is legally recognized, under certain conditions may not be recognized. So an underage, say from the NCPCR in 2010, when Shanta Sinha was at the helm of NCPCR, they came out with a policy brief which said that 12 years upwards, child can consent to non-penetrative sex. And then 14 to 16, they can consent to penetrative sex under certain conditions. So I think we have to rely upon people who work with adolescents, people who want to ensure that adolescents can develop without stigma, without harm, without unnecessary criminalization. So that space will have to be created. And there are enough reports around that. So it's about really nuancing that, not going back to 16.
Yeah, thank you.
But there is no space. You're quite right. If now we are struggling with the whole business of age of marriage, then age of consent is something else altogether. But it is connected, and we should be having a conversation on both simultaneously. And there are other harms, because the child sexual abuse law requires mandatory reporting by doctors and healthcare providers. So if they were to also mandatorily report on marriage and pregnancy, you can see how far the net of criminalization can go, and that it is most certainly going to push a lot of girls to take unsafe services right up till 21 years. So who is the loser in this? Girls. So, in that sense, the child sexual offences law has to be part of this discussion. We can't talk about marriage without that.
Sorry, can I ask a question, Prabha?
Please do.
Hi, Madhu. It's a very fascinating discussion that we're having. I just have have one question to ask and just maybe a doubt. Just trying to understand that, you know, when we have seen that various legal prohibitions and the social messaging in a country has been largely ineffective in addressing the child marriage in India. Do you think that, you know, certain schemes, like for instance, I mean, one is that, do you think that incentivizing education, you know, higher education would help address these issues? And I would like to bring here the case of West Bengal, for instance. In West Bengal, we have, I mean, recently this Kanyashri Prakalp has been initiated by Mamata Banerjee. And do you think that, you know, such schemes are really helpful in empowering, you know, young girls? For example, this scheme says that, you know, anyone who is studying from like standard 8 and above would be given an annual kind of an fee of around 750 till the time that they are doing their higher education, and at the time of getting marriage they will get around 25,000, which is, I mean, do you think that such schemes will help in kind of addressing the issues of child marriage more than, you know, like you know, more than I mean, treading the legal provisions that line, because that takes a lot of time. We know that law takes a lot of time, you know, to get implemented.
See, the point is the law serves a particular purpose, but it can be harmful beyond that purpose. So to set a minimum age is fine, but to train guns on young people is not fine. And to disempower them is not fine. I do think there are a lot of critiques of these Kanyashri type of schemes. So these schemes need to be improved, certainly, but, you know, financial allocations for girls is encouraging. It only shouldn't be fixed around 18 and marriage. It has to go beyond that so that they result in something meaningful rather than in postponing marriage till 18. And it's not just one scheme. Many such interventions need to be there simultaneously. So it's about really looking for other ways to empower. I think it's time to not simply look at the problem in terms of child marriage, because we are looking at another kind of problem. Middle-class people are not getting married young anymore. So it's about giving, you know, those who are pushed into early marriage, giving them, creating options and opportunities for them. It's for a particular group of people. It's not a universal problem in India. So that, you know, financial layouts is one, but there are many others. Right to education up till 18, vocational training and livelihoods. So there are many other things that need to be put in place simultaneously.
Yeah, thanks, Madhu.
So, I mean, I had a question, Madhu, which is, you know, some things, a lot of things that you've said make sense in your presentation, but some things, I wonder whether one could expand the analysis, because the very same international organizations that are talking about, you know, early marriage or child marriage, I mean, there also seems to be constellations of international organizations that are pushing for women's employment, to argue that the unpaid work that they're doing at home is an obstacle to economic growth. So there's a very strong push from international organizations to push women into paid employment, right? And it's quite interesting. And I think, again, I haven't studied this very closely, but it emerges that a lot of them are putting out reports around the time of the SDGs. I don't know if it's inspired by the SDGs, but definitely, I suppose, by SDG 5.4 to say, you know, you have to reduce unpaid work. But there's also a lot of momentum towards making women, fashioning women into a certain kind of economic actor. The second thing that also happens around this time is the Global Slavery Index reports. The first report which came out, I think in 2016, but then in 2017 and 18, there was also talk of marriage being a form of trafficking, forced marriage, so below a certain age. So, there's not been much on that front since then, but there seems that this very huge set of actors, very influential, powerful, well-funded actors, and philanthrocapitalists, as they're called, also pushing to bring marriage within this kind of criminal, backdrop of trafficking, right? Mobilizing trafficking as a way also to deal with early marriage, I suppose. So that's two sets of sort of international developments. And I don't know how much you see this move of the Indian government to be a function of what's happening internationally. Are we trying to keep pace with our South Asian neighbors or international pressure? That's one question. The second question is, I can understand why the government, the age of consent went up to 18 in the context of the rape law amendments, because clearly they don't want, adolescents to exercise sexual agency outside the bounds of marriage. But I think 18 to 21 is an altogether, it just seems very difficult to imagine why a highly conservative government would actually not want women to get married, earlier. And one would suspect that there'd be backlash from all kinds of constituencies of theirs. So there's something there that doesn't quite add up. Can you just sort of help us think through it?
So I haven't really engaged much. Yes, I do know about the whole, paid work movement, but I haven't seen how it dovetails with the child marriage because, as often happens, movements occur and campaigns take place in asylum. So we haven't had that discussion, but definitely domestic work and caregiving work is one of the reasons why girls are married early or girls are sort of pulled out of school early. So I'm afraid I can't really sort of join the dots on that one. But as far as the marriage and trafficking goes, there is a recognition even in the child marriage laws that, that's the exception in which it is a marriage is treated as null and void if a girl is sold for the purposes of trafficking. But clearly those are going to be determined only on a case-to-case by facts and so on. It's not something that's obvious because when a marriage happens, one doesn't know that a sale is going to follow. It's only after the sale follows and there's a prosecution. So precisely my point that actually you're not being able to stop that. That is not within the purview. What is getting prosecuted most are the very visible elopements, because that's where the actors, that's where the family members are willing to prosecute. So how do you get to those exceptional circumstances where marriages are meant to be void? You're not going to find out about it. And about, the second point about, and those actors have not been active on the age of marriage issue, at least not visibly. So if they've sent in submissions, we don't know. The trafficking, the trafficking lobby. So, and on the age of consent issue, yes, I'm also baffled. I don't think they're going to increase it to 21. But, it does mean that they could demand mandatory reporting from healthcare providers of children, of pregnancies. And that itself means that a lot of pregnancies and a lot of girls will be pushed to take services underground or avoid institutional sort of deliveries. So I think that is the fear. I don't think the fear is that that the age of consent will go up. It should actually come down, because even up till 18, the overwhelming number of prosecutions and the number of girls who are in care homes, it should worry us that, for committing no crime, when it is flying in the face of Child Rights Convention, which says you cannot criminalize adolescent sexuality, that in fact they should get access to safe sexual and reproductive health information and services. In fact, the government's own program, the RKSK program, is for that. But it can't be implemented fully because of the whole age of consent issue.
Thank you. That was really great. Thank you. Are there any other questions? I think that's it. So thank you so much for giving us this wonderful talk, and it was very stimulating, and we hope to read everything that PLD is putting out and do share your latest report on Karnataka, I think, because that seems to be key on predicting how this amendment, if it's passed, will what kind of effects it will have on the ground. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye bye.